Well, thank you for hosting me in the Twin Cities. One of my most important heroes is from Minnesota, Justice Blackmun, who served on the United States Supreme Court and was one of the most outstanding champions of keeping God and government separate. But today, the topic is going to be in family. It's going to be about taking atheism to the general public. I'm not speaking so much today as a church-state separationist, but to brother and sister atheists about how we overcome the dismal perspective in which we are held by the general public. I want to say from the outset that an integral component of atheism is being a realist. And that means that we will probably have to spend the rest of this century in order to achieve the recognition and even acceptance that we deserve now and have deserved for millennia. But given the attitudes and the childishness of the way most Americans handle religious questions, it could take 100 years before the secular enlightenment that we all support even gains a foothold. And if we understand that what we hope to achieve in terms of even the equal acceptance of the non-believer is not a phenomenon we're going to see in our lifetimes, then we will have a certain greater peace about our efforts, because it won't happen tomorrow. But the seeds that we plant today and continue to nurture over the next 100 years might eventually bring about the type of more enlightened and less superstitious society than the one in which we have lived and in which we have always lived. In every age, there has been a false start and a hopeful promise for the free thinker that has ultimately fizzled. We had Spinoza in his efforts to question the Bible. Then we had David Hume trying to disparage all miracles, magnificent work. And then we had a true founding father of the American Revolution, Thomas Paine, writing one of the most scathing denunciations of the Bible ever written by anyone. And then in the 19th century, we had our greatest orator ever, Robert Ingersoll, who was heard by more people than any other single orator throughout that century, and yet, outside of those of us involved in free thought, very few Americans have an idea he even lived and spoke across our nation. And so, in every age, in every era, brave non-believers, religious dissenters, and free thinkers have established a challenge to conventional supernatural beliefs. And yet the challenge, regardless of how profound, regardless of how eloquent, ultimately didn't go very far. So we have to be the first atheists in history who begin an effort that will not die in just a few years. And what I'm going to talk about is the mechanisms by which we begin this long process. Martin Luther King, a favorite believer of many of us, once said that the arc of the universe is very long, but it ultimately bends toward justice. As much as I adore Dr. King, I must disagree with this overly optimistic view. It will only bend toward justice if we make it happen. There is no natural force that will lead to the abandonment of supernatural belief systems by the majority of the American people. There is no natural course of evolution that's operating on the American mind to have a greater tolerance for non-belief. We are going and have been going in the opposite direction. The very fact that the newly elected local member of Congress, Keith Ellison, draws so much ire from Christian religionists when he wants to exercise only the same right they do, which is as an individual, taking a secondary oath after the formal one on his own sacred scripture, and that religious right-wing commentators believe it should be illegal for him to do so. And with some of the comments you see around the country, we see that the American people are frightfully immature in the realm of religion and spirituality. We see that most Americans will not even accept alternative religions, let alone non-belief. So how do we begin this long march across the arid desert of prevailing superstition and try to establish some degree of beachhead for atheism and for non-belief? Well, we have really, I think, 4 goals, and they sort of run into each other. Remember as kids sometimes you would take a chocolate vanilla ice cream cone and melt them together and they all run together? It's sort of like these 4 objectives. One, of course, is preserving the separation of church and state and keeping religion and government separate. The second would be to educate the public so that not only will they hear our arguments, but they will accept that it is acceptable for us to even make those arguments. The problem that I have on college campuses when I address atheism or debate believers is that so many members of the audience question whether it's even socially appropriate, let alone legal, for the atheist to make our arguments in public. So we have to first create fertile ground for our arguments to be heard. And then comes the actual presentation for the reasons why we maintain that there are no supernatural forces in this universe, including the God that most people think they believe in. And that is the centerpiece, but to get to that, we have to improve the climate so we can even get a hearing. And then the final portion would be linked, of course, with church-state separation, but linked also with creating a more favorable social climate, would be electing as many of our own to significant political office as possible. And I want to deal with that component first. Polls have shown that more Americans will vote against an atheist than anyone else. Regardless of the horrific and totally unjustified prejudice against gays and lesbians, most Americans would still vote more for a gay candidate than an atheist candidate. Now, I have a whole other lecture on this, which grows out of my own near miss for the California legislature in 2000. I guess I'm not muscular enough to hold high office in California. Of course, this state also has experience with that, but at least we had in Jesse Ventura a thorough defender of church-state separation. But if we, and sometimes we're a contentious lot, if we don't learn how to put aside our views on some other issues and give some slack to a brother or sister atheist, we'll never be able to get any of our own elected to office. We have to take a clue from the gay community. They were able to rally behind their candidates and elect many of them to Congress and state legislatures around the country. And so if an atheist candidate emerges, and even if you don't agree with them on every possible issue under the sun, unless what they stand for violates a core belief of yours, I would recommend that we seriously examine to what degree we can put aside our other political views and help a viable atheist candidate get into Congress or the state legislature. Because if we hold a brother or sister atheist to agree with us on all 1,000 issues out there today, we'll never be able to support one of our own for office. So we have to seriously think, and each of us will draw the line at a different point, but to what extent are we willing to say, I will let candidate A slide on this issue where I may not let another candidate slide because of the larger picture of getting atheists into public office. So that would be an important step. As far as keeping God and government separate, that might require a certain form of, if not single issue voting, primary issue consideration in looking at a candidate. For the survival of the non-believer today, the most important thing we can do is have people in public office who will make sure that government maintains its neutrality in matters of religion. In state legislatures around the country, we have the sickening phenomenon of elected officials falling all over themselves to outdo each other on loyalty to God. We have everything introduced into our state legislatures. In God we trust. Mandatory Pledge of Allegiance bills, requiring days of prayer, trying to get the Ten Commandments posted everywhere except in the bathrooms, maybe, of public schools and libraries. We have state legislators trying to build entire careers on promoting God in government. We must make sure that even if a candidate is a nominal believer or a liberal religionist, that that individual will support government neutrality in matters of religion. And that means that regardless of political party or affiliation, you must, to preserve your freedom and make sure we don't become second-class citizens, support only those candidates who will, if elected, fight to preserve government neutrality in matters of religion, and who believe that no branch of government can favor the believer over the non-believer. You must vote for those candidates that will not allow any religious alternative to evolution to be taught in the public schools. You must vote for those candidates who will not vote to allow a restoration of formally composed prayer in the public schools. You must make sure that you will vote for candidates who will not vote to allow government to give support to religious proselytizing churches to do the social welfare work that government should be doing. These are all issues that you must look to. You must make sure that, consistent with the principles that we hold, that you're not electing somebody who will try to make their political career on the backs of gays and lesbians by championing laws that will oppress them and saying they're doing this only to appease the angry God that they claim to worship. Because if President Bush puts one more person on the Supreme Court before leaving office, all the 60 years of precedent of government neutrality in matters of religion will be nullified, and the non-believer will become a second-class citizen. We now have 4 justices on the Supreme Court who believe that government can favor the believer over us, and all we want is equality. A great example is we don't want the Pledge of Allegiance to say one nation under no God. We just want it silent so that it can be owned by all of us. But yet, many Americans are of the view that government should promote religion. And we have a massive educational process that we need to undergo that will take decades to make sure that people give up this selfish belief. But in the meantime, we have to preserve a Supreme Court that says, as it has always said from 1947 onward through the present day, we don't care if a majority of Americans want this form of government-sponsored religion. We will not let it happen. Up until today, That has been the unbroken line of consequences of Supreme Court opinion. But now our majority is down to 5-4. With a shift of just one vote on the High Court, the floodgates can be opened as never before for government to favor the believer over the non-believer. Last year, in a chilling dissenting opinion, Justice Scalia openly said the First Amendment does not protect the devout atheist. That is the harbinger of second-class citizenship for us. That is the beginning of the yellow badge that atheists have to wear. That is the beginning of a myriad of laws from Congress and the legislatures that we can't even begin to imagine, which will give special rights to only the religious. Justice O'Connor said right before retiring from the court, church-state separation has worked so well for the United States, and its absence has caused so much strife elsewhere, that she urges her colleagues not to abandon it. Now, as far as message, the core message that we need to bring to the general public, and the kind of bifurcated approach we have to take. First, making sure that the public will even hear us, and then secondly, framing the arguments. To make sure the public will even hear us, we have to be visible. We have to talk to friends and neighbors. We have to talk to community groups. We have to talk to church groups. We have to have debates on college campuses. And we have to point out that the essence of America is hearing all sides, and that you cannot begin with the default that religion is true and that its alternative is false. That's something that's open for debate. We must till the soil so that people even give us a hearing. I had a very chilling experience earlier this year. I was speaking at the University of Florida, Central Florida in Orlando, and I did an address to a mixed group of students, about 100 of them, on why there really is no God, where I presented the atheistic evidence and the arguments. Even the religious students admitted that my arguments were powerful, but a majority of the students said afterwards that while they could not come up with answers to the points that I was raising, they didn't believe it should have been even legal for me to make those arguments in public. So the task is to first incline ever larger segments of the American people to accept the legal and even social propriety of atheists explaining why we reject God's existence. Now, even if people accept that it should be legal reluctantly for us to make our arguments, most Americans believe that it is impolite for the atheist to articulate our views, that somehow religious dogma deserves a special pass in polite society, and that you are uncouth or you are somehow socially maladjusted. That in essence, for the atheist to go before a public audience and give the reasons why the atheist believes there is no God is the social equivalent, quite frankly, of farting in an elevator. And we have to get the American people to see that it is the final result of the accumulation of world intellectual history, and that the scientific naturalism that rejects the supernatural requires this kind of discussion to take place. We have to very honestly recognize that a clear majority of the American people are very immature when it comes to religion and spirituality. This is self-evident. We don't berate them or insult them because of this, but we have to get going in trying to educate them. Now, in terms of delivery of message, we have to make sure that we are as honest and forthright about our beliefs as we can possibly be, simultaneously being as diplomatic as possible. We don't want to insult, but we don't want to pull punches. And it is doable. You don't say to someone that they're an idiot because they believe in God. What you say is you understand the transcendental temptation, as Paul Kurtz called it 20 years ago. You understand the yearning for supernatural salvation, but the evidence is not there and it's contrary. You understand why people want to live forever, but the overwhelming evidence that consciousness is a byproduct of a physical brain renders that highly unlikely, and mature human beings need to recognize that. You have to say that you understand the passion and yearning for miracles, but that throughout human history there has not been a single instance of a verified supernatural event anywhere in human history. You have to become familiar with the atheistic arguments, and then you have to make them in a way that is kindly and polite but does not pull punches. Also, very important, we cannot let the fox guard the henhouse. We can never let the prevailing religious sentiment in society determine for us what is out of bounds or within bounds in arguing against religious belief systems. You never let your enemy decide what is too offensive for you to say. And we do not let the other side define our vocabulary. We do not let the other side demonize the word atheist. We take the word, we rehabilitate it, and we restore it to a place of honor. Again, learning from the gay community, look at the marvelous social political turnaround that they did with the word queer. Look at all the college campuses across the country in the past 10 years with the signs, "We're queer and we're here, accept us." Look at how they took that word, which was initially pejorative, and used that as a badge of honor to wrest respect away from a homophobic society. Let's learn from that. Let's allow the gay community's stellar political successes to teach us the process of climbing the ladder when you're the member of a despised minority primarily because of people's religious convictions. That's what we share in common with the gay community, is we are a despised minority and the hatred toward us derives from religion. That is the one common element that we have with the gay community. Let's learn from them. Because with all the homophobic hatred in this country, they are still farther along than we are in terms of the public attitude. You can be openly gay and be elected to many state legislatures. It does not work if you're openly atheist. I'll give you an example. In 1994, I was the runner-up in a Democratic primary for the state assembly in the Santa Monica area. I was defeated by the woman who was then the first lesbian in the state legislature, Sheila Kuehl, now state senator, who those of you old enough will remember played Zelda on the old Dobie Gillis show in the late 50s and early 60s. And when I ran again in 2000 in the Long Beach area, had another close second place finish, she said to me, she said, "Eddie, can you hide the fact that you're an atheist and just call yourself an agnostic?" And I said, "Sheila, look at where we've come in society. The lesbian has to tell the white heterosexual atheist if maybe he should muffle it." I said that would be almost like when you ran for office, if a close friend said, "Sheila, can you at least say you're bi?" And we were laughing at this, but it showed how far down on the pecking order we are. Now, in terms of actual strategic approaches, it's also important that we sponsor as many college and university debates as possible. We must get our best speakers and debaters on college campuses to speak and debate on why there is no God. Because for the atheistic arguments, which are so powerful, to take hold, for people to recognize that we live in a natural universe with no supernatural agencies, we have to get our arguments out there in frequent appearances, because we will be planting seeds. Another example, when I debated in Canada 5 years ago at Queen's University, one of their Ivy League schools, I debated the head of their Campus Crusade for Christ. We drew about 600 students, and the issue was, does God exist? Well, 10 Christian students came up to me afterwards and said, I didn't shake their belief in God, but I challenged their belief in the fundamental fairness of exclusive salvation through Jesus, and I said, you made the entire trip worthwhile. That was enough of a seed to plant for one debate. But there need to be many debates in campuses all over this country. This state is a marvelous experimental laboratory for atheism, because here in Minnesota, you have it all. This is a state which really wobbles on the questions of church-state separation and religion. You have parts of the state that are pretty fundamentalist or very traditional in their views. And then you have the Twin Cities. This is a perfect state up for grabs, and the prize being not just a legal but a social victory for the general public's acceptance of the non-believer. So many of you need to consider, if you'll run for local city council, will you run for school board? Will you talk to your neighbor? Will you ask the local Kiwanis Club if they will hear a presentation on why God does not exist? Will the local Rotary Club hear you? Will there be some town meeting where you can speak out and say that the non-believer is a threat to no one and we just want equality? And then when people ask you, explain that unfortunately, as joyous as it would be to live forever, this is the evidence, this is the human brain, this is the physical world, there's no evidence of the supernatural, this is all the arguments for evolution. Look how intelligent design has no peer-reviewed scientific support. Look at what some of these religious people are doing. Look at the Reverend Haggard in his massive hypocrisy of condemning the gay community and then being a member of it himself, but doing it in secret. Bring all of these up, but then say to the believer, you don't want to take away their legal right to believe, you just want to join the marketplace of ideas. But all of these approaches will have to span out over decades to come. We cannot be disheartened by the way most people see us now, but we have to be realistic. In today's America, when people identify us or when we identify ourselves, the atheist is the still most unjustly despised minority in the country today. Once people think of us, they hate us more than anyone else. Look at the absolute virulence directed at Mike Newdow when all he wanted to do was to make the Pledge of Allegiance neutral. The death threats, the everything that happened to him, the hatred directed at him. All of that because he wanted the Pledge of Allegiance to be equally owned by all Americans. And so if we begin today, this hour, this minute, no one in this room may live to see the outcome. But as Bobby Kennedy once said, what we do today will have an impact in the distant future. There is a very, very bleak landscape facing America today. Supernatural belief systems and the prejudices that flow from that are everywhere. But yet we have to have the vision to look into the horizon and to discern a possibility that we can make real decades from now, and that is the vision of a better and more enlightened future. Thank you.